Varmt välkomna till Se människan-scenen. Röda sirener, en ukrainsk familjehistoria är titeln på nästa programpunkt här på scenen. Och de som vi möter här är Victoria Belim, journalist och översättare, och Maria Bergius, präst i Göteborgs domkyrkoförsamling. Och som ni ser av texten här så kommer det här samtalet att föras på engelska. So welcome both of you.
Thank you. This book that you've written, we talked about it a little. It's a book that has a lot to do with memory and with loss and grief. And yet it's not a dark book. It's also a book about life. I'd like to start in Brussels because at one point I read the book and then I called my daughter into the room and I said, listen, you gotta listen to this part. And I read her the part where you describe how you walk around in Brussels annoyed at the old ladies walking their dogs in the Parc Royal, and at everything that happens while there's a war going on at the same time. Do you remember that part?
Yes, I remember.
Yeah. And she was struck by memory and by loss because she grew up a couple of years in Brussels. So that was her entrance into it. What was the reason for the fact that you started searching for your family history? How did it start?
It started in 2014. It started with the start of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine in 2014. And I really say war, because for me, war started in 2014. It was such a shocking event because I have to explain that my family is quite multinational, multicultural. My father is Russian, my mother is Ukrainian. I grew up without a very strong sense of identity. We never really focused on what was Russian, who was Ukrainian in the family. It never mattered. But when the war started in 2014, suddenly all these questions became relevant, and the equilibrium that I had until then in my life was upended.
Yeah.
And I wanted to understand who I was, what was Ukrainian about me, and why this country where I no longer lived, because I left Ukraine when I was 15, I moved to the United States. And I wanted to understand why I felt so much pain as Ukraine went through a very painful period. Mm-hmm. Why its pain became my own to the extent that I couldn't sleep, that I could not do anything, that I was completely consumed by it. So I decided to return to Ukraine and search for my roots, for my belonging.
You write in the book at one point that it is through our relatives, dead or alive, that we are who we are. And how that connection, the connection with the past, makes us into who we are. And it seems like that's something that really became clear to you through this journey of discovery, that this is one of the main things that you discovered, that the connection to the relatives, to the history, is something that makes you into who you are.
It shapes us. People who came before shape us in ways sometimes we don't understand until much later, until we're much older. Mm-hmm. And in my family, we have many stories. It's something we take pride in. Stories about great-grandparents, things that they've done. And my great-grandparents, they've survived a lot. They survived First World War, they survived the Bolshevik Revolution, then the Civil War. occupations, famine, Second World War, and another famine, and so on. It's endless. And then there are different stories from the family, these historical junctures, what they've done, how they've acted, how they behaved, how they relied on their faith or on their ideology to guide them through that period. And we keep repeating these stories to us as a way of, as an example, a roadmap.
Mm-hmm.
However, then I discovered that things are not quite so simple, because these stories are a little bit like legends.
Yeah.
They have holes, and they're not quite true.
Right. Through our stories, we create a history that we can live with. And sometimes those holes are a way of coping with a past that's very painful. And reading through your book, I realized that I need to research things here. So I looked up the word Holodomor. I'm not sure if I pronounce it correctly.
Yes.
Would you like to explain what it is? I'm not sure that everyone knows it.
Holodomor is what Ukrainians call the Great Famine of 1932-1933. It was a man-made famine designed to crush Ukrainian independence and to crush the Ukrainian peasantry, because peasantry in Ukraine was quite strong. Ukrainian land is extremely fertile, and so traditionally peasants had their own plots of land, because a small plot of land in a fertile area like Ukraine would be enough for a family to survive.
Mm-hmm.
So people's attachment to their land is very strong, is extremely strong. When the push for collectivization came with Stalin, many people resisted. Whole villages resisted. They absolutely did not want to give up their livestock. They did not want to give up their land and to the collective farm, because it's essentially going into the unknown, complete unknown. And the history of Ukraine is defined for fight for the land.
Right.
So when grain became confiscated, so these peasants could not fight, of course, against the big Soviet military machine, and they were forced onto these collective farms, and then the grain was taken from them to ship to the cities. And for 2 years, there was a great famine where people starved. By some estimates, it's 3 million of people who starved. By others, it's 11 million. And so this famine left a deep imprint, extremely deep trauma in many families, including ours.
Yeah.
And the memory of this famine, it just persists, despite the fact that people could not speak about it freely because it was a taboo topic. During Soviet Union, it was completely a forbidden topic.
And it's still controversial in many ways, because people have different views of it, including within your own family.
Yes. In my mother's family, my great-grandparents were teachers in a small village school, so they've experienced this famine firsthand. They saw their students die day by day as famine lingered. They themselves starved. They barely survived, and in fact, they got married only because it was easier for two people to survive together, pooling their resources. On the other hand, on my father's side of the family, there are people who are skeptical about the famine, who take a very Soviet view on the famine as a kind of an accident, as not something planned, but rather something accidental, and certainly not on the scale in which it happened.
And this conflict actually is one of the themes of the book as well, because it came to a head, the conflict between you and your uncle, right?
Yes. The book opens up on the story of the conflict between my uncle Vladimir, who is my father's older brother. And in 2014, I turned to him for comfort. And I have to explain that he's the only remaining link to my father's side of the family. So he was someone who's very important to me. And he's a very impressive person in many different ways. He's also a survivor, and he's quite inspiring. But his views are very pro-Soviet. And so his views on Ukrainian history are likewise then influenced by that perspective, that, including that of the famine. Right now, I'm able to talk about it with some degree of detachment, but in 2014, when I was completely overwhelmed by the events and I wanted his support and I did not receive it, in fact, I received a lecture, then it came to a head, so we had a big falling out.
Yeah. It's one of the driving stories of the book, that development and what happens there. And I won't tell you all what happens in the end, because that would be like revealing the good part. But memory and grief and trauma leads to generational trauma, to intergenerational trauma, to things that are passed down the generations, and that's a very clear theme as well in the book. And I looked up generational trauma, and I found a study that talked about the survivors of the Holodomor and what signs you could see, how the effects had been on descendants and children of descendants. And one of the things they speak of is living in survival mode. Horror, fear, mistrust, sadness, shame, anger, stress and anxiety, decreased self-worth, stockpiling of food, overeating, inability to discard unneeded items, indifference toward others, social hostility, and risky health behaviors. It's a long list of horrible complications of life.
And hoarding of food and inability to discard unnecessary things is something I recognize from my family so clearly.
Yeah. I thought about your grandmother's garden shed, the sarai, in her garden, and how it was full of things.
The most random things.
Yeah. One of the things that made me laugh was you turned this weird thing around, and it turned out to be a head of Lenin.
Yes, it was actually in our shower.
In the shower, right.
Because we had, my grandmother lived in the village, and the bathroom was built much later after the main house was built. So it was in a separate building, and part of the bathroom was a shed. So that was a very makeshift construction. And one day I was getting out of the shower, and I realized there was this big, strange styrofoam thing sitting in the corner, and I had no idea what it was. I turned it around, and I realized it was a big cutout portrait of Lenin. So I've been taking shower with Lenin for weeks without knowing it. And it was a completely strange experience. When I started looking through our sheds, I discovered more portraits of Lenin, more cutouts of Lenin, and it was like Lenin was everywhere. But then, of course, my grandmother explained that these were the artifacts from my great-grandfather. Sergei. He was a teacher, director of the local school, and he kept these items for various school functions and parades and so on. And so after his death and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they just became part of the flotsam in the sarai, part of the things that are unwanted but undiscarded.
Yeah. Understandable.
No, it's not completely understandable to me why we kept these portraits of Lenin all these years.
Yeah, it's strange.
It is strange.
And yet it's understandable when you look at it through the lens of trauma. How you're not able to let go, and yet you never want to talk about it. That connection, you can. you can put distance between yourself and talk about it in a way that's non-emotional, but your own involvement and your own part of this is impossible to talk about because that makes you a part of this story. Yeah.
Yes, it's the inability to talk about things. It's a paradox because on the one hand we talked about these stories, the family stories, and we kept repeating them as these legends. On the other hand, certain historical events became so shrouded in this oblivion and the inability to talk about it that it's very this duality is very difficult to process. Mm-hmm. And so part of the history in the family never ended up being processed. And that's essentially, you could see from the level of the family to the level of the nation. That's the tendency in Ukraine. In Ukraine, history is very much unprocessed, not quite understood, because Ukraine had also a very complicated, very brutal 20th century. And this recent history still remains kind of in the flux. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about it within families. So we don't talk about it on a bigger forum.
Yeah. I look at the book and all the people in your book, and it seems your grandmother, Valentina, is impersonating this. She's embodying this attitude of let's not talk too much, let's just work. Like, we don't have time for anxiety and angst. We need to plant our garden. And how this constant moving forward is, on the one hand, something that keeps Ukraine going. Because the trauma is so big and there's so much to deal with that if it was dealt with all at the same time, no one knows what would happen. And at the same time, it keeps people from living their fullest lives at the same time. And Valentina seems a perfect image for that.
I agree with you. She's, her perspective was just to cope, is to work in the garden, to focus on what needed to be done. And of course, you know, another very important element to this, with her obsession with the garden, is the attachment to the land.
Yeah.
And that's the priority. Land is the priority. So once again, we come back to this very salient feature in Ukraine's identity, the land. How do you protect the land, and what do you do to make sure that the land is receiving the proper care that it needs? And then the other aspect of it is coping with trauma. Yeah. When even in wartime, you have to eat, you have to survive. So why don't we plant our garden? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the land is both a place where we remember, but also a place where we deal with our memories, and it's the place that reminds us of life. I think you call it memento vivere.
Memento vivere.
The memories connected to life that is connected to a place where you actually remember to live. So in that sense, this book is not only about loss, and it's not only about trauma, it's also about how to regain life with the memory of trauma intact. And I thought one of the fascinating things and one of the most evocative things are the rushniki, the embroidered pieces of cloth. Will you explain what they are?
A rushnik is a long embroidered piece of cloth. It has embroideries on both sides of it, and it's usually used in different ways. It's used in church to decorate the icons, mm-hmm. and to decorate crucifixion. It's used at home for the most of utilitarian purposes, but also to frame the portraits of the deceased. It's used during weddings, it's used during funerals, it welcomes a newborn. So it has many symbolic functions. And the embroidery itself has many symbolic functions and as a talisman. because it's something that's done by hand. And then there is a very special type of ruchnik. It's usually embroidered for the church, and it has religious symbolisms in it. And of course, during the Soviet Union, you could not create such things. And so people tried to hide the crosses and the certain religious symbols in very complicated embroideries. And I found in Ukraine that many people collected these rushniki and created their own private archives of memories and these suppressed memories. And it was extremely touching and moving.
How memory actually gets shape and body through these pieces of cloth. Thank you. So I'll just end this with a quote or a near quote, because I've read the book in Swedish, so I'm not quite sure how it was in English. But you meet a person in Kiev, and this person says, "If little flowers can survive a hard winter, so can we." So in the end, it's also a story about resilience. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for coming here and talking to us.
Thank you.